So when we think of nuclear events, big names come to mind: 3 Mile, Chernobyl, Fukushima. Yet we're assured that international standards continue to improve as science advances and we learn more and more about how to contain and eliminate radioactive contamination. Today, proponents say that science has rendered nuclear energy to be clean, safe, and sustainable. Yet there are countries because we were already talking about China, opting for cheaper technologies or exhibiting very poor safety records in general. The rush to build nuclear power plants and produce nuclear energy can lead to many potential health and safety concerns. With the climate crisis being a very real and imminent deadline being imposed on the entire world, what is safe, and how can we be sure that nuclear energy is safe?
Well, I think this falls into the very big trade-offs category. That it is, it is precisely one of the potential trade-offs embedded around any sort of major expansion of nuclear in relation to climate change, is that these risks would be there. The industry makes claims about new generations of reactors that are supposedly inherently safe, although that's what they said with the earlier generations too. So, and in Ontario's case, I mean, we're not changing the technology at all. We are rebuilding CANDUs as CANDUs at Bruce and at Darlington. And we're hopefully retiring Pickering as soon as possible. So it's, I mean, I don't know. I mean, part of the issue here is that the consequences of something going wrong, as we've seen at Chernobyl and Fukushima, are sort of categorically different from anything with any other energy technology. In terms of the duration and scope of the impacts that would occur. I mean, I think Fukushima, they're running somewhere in the neighborhood of $250 billion, and major parts of what to do are still unresolved. In terms of, they have huge quantities of radioactive water that have accumulated. They want to release into the Pacific Ocean because they don't have anything else to do with them. So it's very hard to see how you get to safe in this case, because in some ways we've been through an unfortunate experience of discovery of failure modes that designers didn't anticipate. That's a problem. I mean, the industry to some degree has always had more than a touch of technological hubris to it. And so this, again, I just put in the sort of risk and trade-off basket that, yes, potentially low carbon, but there are no free lunches, and there are potentially a lot of trade-offs here, and one of them is the risk of catastrophic events.
I can say, I just will kind of say I agree with what Mark is saying. I think, so again, I'll just kind of go back to this, and I'm just saying what I hear from proponents of nuclear, both some of those speaking in the chat, but also who are committed to the environment. And the language that is now being used is that there are problems with nuclear, but that it's safer than any other form of energy. And so that's why we should adopt it, that kind of the language of safer. And the analogy, it reminds me of the analogy of kind of planes versus cars, right? When you say to somebody who's afraid to get on an airplane, you say to them, if you look at the statistics, planes are much safer than cars. So really you should be, if you see the statistics, you shouldn't go driving. You should only go in in planes. But of course, we know that planes still crash. And this happens for lots of reasons. This happens for some of the same reasons that we had meltdowns. There's design flaws, there's engineering problems, there's poor decisions made by those who are in control. And so given, again, to just reinforce what Mark said, given the consequences of the kind of the crash of that supposedly safe mechanism for generating power, I can't say that safe has to be in scare quotes. There are things that can happen that have huge outcomes, that have that create situations where, like around Chernobyl, it will not be remediated for, I think the figure I saw was 300 years, just to kind of have basic livability, which is not to say there hasn't been people who have moved back in there. So that's not really safe. It is this sense when that word is used, it is meant to say this is the only, our only option. So then I always want to ask, well, what is being claimed in order to make that assertion? Like, is it that we as a civilization need a certain amount of energy, and as a result, we have to look to see where that is, and if we can use some type of energy that only produces this outcome, then we're fine, as opposed to making other kinds of decisions. In this discussion of nuclear, we haven't really talked about renewables as an option other than nuclear. There's this kind of been this, I'm not saying that of my co-host, I'm saying a little bit of the chat. There's this sense that nuclear is all important and there aren't other ways to get to where one wants to be in terms of generating energy. The other thing I would want to put in there is that perhaps Fukushima was not a climate change, consequence of climate change, but I think it might have been one of the first disasters of the three, 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima, that started to make us think about climate impacts on reactors. So reactors need water. And they're often on, if you look at a map of reactors around the world, you'll see that many of them are, many of them are on ocean sides. Others are along rivers, some are near lakes. Climate change is making those bodies of water less and less predictable. One of the reports I saw about Fukushima is that even if it was to be brought online, in order to safeguard against future tsunamis or sea level rise, an incredibly large concrete wall would have to be erected in the ocean to guard against that. Now, again, the size of that wall has an engineering figure attached to it. It's a 100-year fail-safe. We've had many 100-year events happen. Things that aren't supposed to happen for 100 years or 200 years or 1,000 years happen. If we need water for reactors, does it become less safe? Like, let's put aside the design elements. Are these types of energy, are these energy sources that we want to depend on, as opposed to other types of solutions that we might have for, what we're really talking about is trying to limit greenhouse gases when we produce energy. There are other ways to do that. So what is it specifically that those who are interested and committed to nuclear, what is it that they're trying to tell us when they tell us it's safe? Is it just about the scale of the production? Is it about the fact that they want everything to stay exactly the same, or even to have expanded access to energy? I think safe is questionable, and if only for what to do with the waste. but the design of the reactors will fail. It will happen for some of the reasons that I mentioned, and climate may have a role in creating even more failure in the future.
Yeah, to add on to that, I really like the tie into the climate crisis. I mean, I think that it creates uncertainty, right? I mean, changing patterns, changing weather. There's the places where nuclear plants were built were chosen often because of water access and stability, right? So like that's why the DGRs are being considered in the locations, the deep geologic repositories are being considered in the locations that they are, is that there's not a lot of tectonic plate activity in those areas. So there's not likely to be a lot of disturbing of that waste once it's buried. I think that this kind of ties into my broader point around safety, which is that we can't predict what we can't predict as people. So Goderich, which is about 45 minutes to an hour away from the Bruce nuclear plant, about an hour from where I grew up in Port Elgin, had a tornado a few years back that went through the downtown. Those kind of things never used to happen in my region. It was considered very rare. And there have been a couple of different instances of this since then. I mean, of course, I see that as being part of the climate crisis. But it also creates uncertainty around the stability of these locations that these nuclear plants have been built in, because the changing patterns, the changing weather, the changing behavior, we can't predict what's going to happen with it in the way that we used to be able to. And that kind of leads into my other point, which was that there's always a chance for human error in everything. But to both of your point, the potential for a relatively small error to have a significant impact when it comes to the nuclear industry is pretty high. And I think that's where a lot of the concern around it comes from that standpoint. A seemingly small mistake has a significant impact. And growing up in a nuclear area, I heard a lot of informal stories from people that safety precautions weren't always followed to the degree that they're supposed to be. And the standards in theory are strong, but aren't always executed well in practice, which I think we've all seen in some of those disasters that have happened. I'm not saying it's to that point at all around here. I'm not saying that, but there's always the potential, and safe is only as safe as what you can predict and what the regulations can control, right? And there's always going to be things that are unpredictable and that we can't control. So it's all about managing those risks and those impacts, and to Mark's point, the trade-off in what we want to see, I guess.